You know that story we're always told about the UK economy? The one about tight budgets, tough choices, and having to pull in our belts? Well, what if a huge part of that story, a piece worth over £1 trillion, has been hiding in plain sight this whole time?
So let's just jump right into the mystery, shall we? Since 2007, the UK government's day-to-day spending has been about £1 trillion more than its income. So you'd think, logically, that public debt would go up by that same amount, right? Nope. It actually shot up by £2.3 trillion. That leaves this massive £1.3 trillion gap. So, where did all that extra debt come from?
To figure this out, the first thing we have to do is get our language straight. You see, politicians and the media throw the word deficit around a lot, and honestly, it can be super confusing. We need to nail this down before we can go any further.
Okay, so here's the key thing you need to know. There are two main ways to talk about the deficit. First, you've got the current budget deficit. That's the £1 trillion number we've been talking about. It's just the gap in day-to-day running costs. But then there's the headline deficit, which is the big one that includes everything, like long-term investments in things like roads and hospitals. For this investigation, we're zeroing in on that smaller, day-to-day number because that's what really tells us about the government's core operational finances.
All right, now that we've got our terms sorted, let's put some hard numbers to this thing. And you might want to brace yourself because the scale of this mystery is, well, it's huge.
Let's just walk through it. Since 2007, the UK's total public debt has exploded. It's gone up by a staggering £2.3 trillion.
But, as we just established, the actual gap, the money needed for day-to-day stuff, was only £1 trillion of that.
So you do the math. That leaves us with our mystery number, £1.3 trillion. A massive difference between the debt we actually have and the funding gap we were told caused it. And this, right here, is the crucial question. If only $1 trillion was actually needed to run the country day to day, what in the world was the other $1.3 trillion for?
So, our investigation points to a few key suspects that explain where this money went. A couple of them are pretty big, but there is one that is the real elephant in the room.
Okay, here's the lineup. A pretty big chunk, around $700 billion, went into long-term capital investments, so infrastructure and things like that. The bank bailouts back in 2008, that added another $140 billion. But just look at that third item, quantitative easing, or QE. That accounts for a colossal £900 billion of public liabilities. This is the heart of our mystery. So what on earth is quantitative easing? You'll often hear it called money printing, but honestly, that's pretty misleading. A much better way to think about it is like a gigantic state-backed insurance policy. The government basically stepped in to absorb an incredible amount of risk from the private financial system to stop it from completely collapsing. Not just once, but twice. The state became the ultimate backstop, the ultimate insurer for the entire financial sector. But here's the thing. Taking on all that risk wasn't just a one-time deal. It created this huge, ongoing cost that is still being paid, right now, today. And it's a cost that almost no one ever talks about.
£35 billion. Just let that number sit there for a moment. This isn't a one-off payment. This is happening every single year.
So, where does this £35 billion a year come from? Well, essentially, it's the interest that the state, and that means us, the taxpayers, pays to commercial banks. And what are we paying them for? For holding the electronic money that was created during QE to save them. It's an interest payment on the very money that was created to rescue them in the first place. This isn't some weird fluke, it's baked into the very design of QE.
Now, to really put that £35 billion figure into perspective, let's compare it to something we hear about constantly. The UK's typical underlying deficit in a normal year is about £25 billion. Yeah, let that sink in. The annual cost of this single policy choice is bigger than the entire budget shortfall that dominates our political conversation.
Once you understand this payment, it changes everything. It completely reframes the whole story we're told about the UK's finances. It stops being a story about scarcity and starts being a story about choice.
So, here's the absolute crucial point. If this one single annual payment to banks were restructured or even just eliminated, and the analysis we're drawing on says that's entirely possible, the UK's structural deficit in a normal year would just vanish. We wouldn't have a deficit, we'd be running a surplus.
And this all leads to a really powerful conclusion. This narrative we hear all the time about managed decline, about a country that just can't afford good public services anymore. It isn't some law of nature.
It's the direct results of a political choice to prioritize protecting the financial sector, even at the expense of the public.
Okay, so if a £35 billion annual payment is basically the sole reason the UK has a deficit, the obvious question is, why isn't anyone talking about this?
The silence is pretty much everywhere you look. The Bank of England, the Treasury, Parliament, the big think tanks, the mainstream media. I mean, they all report the numbers, sure, but they bury them in such complex technical jargon that it completely hides the simple reality. No major institution is connecting the dots for the public.
And you have to understand, this complexity isn't an accident. It serves a very real purpose. It keeps this topic out of the public square, it prevents a wider debate, and it keeps this enormous and avoidable cost locked firmly in place, away from any kind of real democratic accountability.
So we end here. The mystery of the £1.3 trillion reveals a much deeper truth. The UK's financial story isn't actually about scarcity. It's about priorities. It's a story where a single payment to the financial sector is bigger than the nation's entire underlying deficit. And that leaves us with one final, very important question. What should our priorities be?